There we go. As the voice has spoken, so shall it be. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Hope everybody's had a good week since our last class. I know I got to see some of you since then, so that was lovely. Some of you I haven't seen since then, so it's lovely to see you again. And glad you're here and glad you're joining us and learning together today. So here's what we're going to do today. We are going to look at Parashat Lech Lecha, which is our Torah reading this week. We're going to look at two different views of the tzaddik, of the rebbe, and the rebbe's relationship with his congregation, which is a really kind of critical part of Hasidic thought. So we're going to look at one text. If we have time, we'll get to the second. And the reason I'm bringing in two is because I think the first one is a little atypical. It's a fascinating way to look at leadership and the relationship between the leader and his followers, or her followers. But it's not the one that's most spoken of during Hasidic thought. So I put it at the bottom a little. If we have time, we'll get to something that's a little more. It's a snippet, but it's a little more what you'll see more generally. And if we don't get to it, it comes up kind of frequently. So we'll get to it eventually if we don't get to it today. But we'll kind of see how it goes. So any questions to start off? Any lingering questions from last week? I should have kind of started with that, but cool. So let me see. There we go. So can you guys see the text? Everybody good? All right. So again, welcome back. Welcome to Parashat Lech Lecha, our Torah reading for this week. We're going to start from Reb Elimelech of Lezinsk. When you talk about classic Hasidut, there's a couple names that come to mind usually. And if you study Hasidut, like there's a couple classical rabbis. The Baal Shem Tov, obviously, the Maggid of Mezrich we talked about, Kedushat Levi, who we studied last week. And one of those is the Noam Elimelech. So Reb Elimelech is largely responsible and known for really teasing out, explaining, illustrating the role of the Rebbe in Hasidic thought. And what does it mean to be a Rebbe? What does it mean to be a leader of a community? What does that entail? Who is he, and how does this all work? And what should the relationship look like? This is largely, he is the one who really deals with that in particular. One kind of background piece, which I'm not sure if I mentioned or not. A lot of Hasidic rebbes in general, to some extent in rabbinic world also, but particularly in Hasidic thought, you're often known by your most prominent book that you publish. So you won't always hear people going around talking about Reb Elimelech of Lezinsk, but you might hear them say, the Noam Elimelech says this, because that's his most prominent book. Or you might not always hear Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, but you might hear, the Kedushat Levi says this. So just as a side note, you might hear that in particular, and sometimes I'll slip in between the two. I'll say Reb Elimelech, or I'll say, the Noam Elimelech is kind of, this is what was he trying to teach today? So kind of want to put that out there. Often you're known by your most prominent publication. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Who wants to start with the verse for today? Somebody will volunteer to read it.
I'll go ahead and read.
Please.
Okay. There was a famine in the land, and Abram descended to Egypt to dwell there. Genesis 12:10.
Perfect. So that's the verse and comes pretty much near the beginning of the Parsha, in the beginning of what we read, is the Avram and Sarai, his wife, moved to the land of Canaan, and they settle there. But then a famine comes, and they are forced to go down to Egypt. And it is there that Abraham tries to pass off Sarah as his wife. As his sister instead of his wife, to protect him. And then Pharaoh takes Sarah in, but God doesn't let Pharaoh actually have sex with her, and so it becomes a complicated whole thing that goes on there. But and then God, Pharaoh gets mad at Abraham for lying to him, but sends him away with a lot of wealth, and that helps Abraham out in the long term. Really odd, difficult story to kick off Avram's narrative, but we're going to focus more on this part, the famine in the land and Avram descending to Egypt to dwell there. Do you want to, I think, Tammy, you were reading. Do you want to continue?
Yeah. Okay. We can interpret this as a spiritual practice, as scripture says, not a famine of food and not a thirst for water, but rather to hear the word of Hashem. Amos 8:11. We find that the essence of this famine is if, God forbid, the Jewish people do not behave properly and follow their mischievous hearts, God forbid. By doing so, they even cause the complete tzaddik to descend from his great holy level through his deeds. And this is what scripture says. There was a famine in the land, as mentioned above.
Okay.
Keep going. Okay.
Take a break for a moment. So let's just back. What's going on here?
So if I'm reading this correctly, and it may be a little difficult because I just got new contacts, so bear with me. There was not a famine of food or water as we typically read it, but rather a famine because they weren't hearing God. Is that?
So kind of.
Okay.
It's not Avram and Sarai in particular necessarily.
Right. Okay.
But there's a spiritual famine among the Jewish people. Everybody follow that? The people are not behaving properly. The people are transgressing. The people are following their hearts rather than God's will.
Mm-hmm.
And in this spiritual famine, they even drag the tzaddik down with them.
Hey, Rabbi, how many Jewish people are we talking about here?
That's a good question. I think you could read it in a couple ways. I think the way I was reading it is not necessarily a number, but a community. So if you imagine the tzaddik or the rebbe as the head of a community, it's that particular community who might not be acting well or might not behaving well, and as we're going to see, kind of drags the tzaddik down with them. So I don't want to put a number on it, but I don't think it's worldwide. I think he's thinking of it in relationship to his congregation.
Now, I have a question.
Yes.
Because I was under the impression that when Abraham went down to Egypt, they weren't yet Jews. I thought they were still like pagans, kind of, sort of.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. So I'm a little confused.
So I want to say two things. One, well, let's get back to Abraham in a moment, but I think the way the Hasidic rebbes are going to read it, and the way Midrash generally works, is that you shouldn't be reading the Torah in a literal sense. So when it says that there was a famine in the land and Avram descended to Egypt to dwell there, this is not historical fact, and you're not supposed to read it as historical fact. It's what was happening. There was a spiritual famine, and the people that were around Avram were misbehaving. They were acting mischievously. They were following their own hearts rather than God's will. And this caused even Avram to have to descend from his high spiritual level.
And are we also to read the going to Egypt or Mitzrayim as on a non-practical level, or are we supposed to interpret that part?
Yes,
as
we
well?
will. That's going to be interpreted non-literally as well.
Non-literally.
That's going to be in the next paragraph. So
Oh,
we'll come
sorry.
back to it. No, you're fine. But yes, that's going to be read also in a metaphorical sense. Now, to get back to the other question about Abraham in the first place, by virtue of, at the very opening of the Parsha, is that God speaks to Avram and says, "Lech lecha me'artzecha," go forth from your land, from your land, from your ancestral home, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will make your name great and be a blessing. By virtue of Avram following God's commandment to do so, there's a covenant between God and Abraham or Avram at that moment. So by virtue of Avram accepting God's commandment, Avram and God are already in relationship with each other. There's a lot of question about where do you actually start counting the people? When do we start being Jewish? Historically, that's a really, really complicated question, because the term Jew doesn't really apply until like late Second Temple. And that's usually the Romans, and it's kind of the Roman designation for them. However, by the way, it comes from Yehudah, which is why in Hebrew Jews are called Yehudim. It comes from Judah, who is actually, Jacob's fourth born son, but also becomes the dominant tribe in which Jerusalem is located, and it gets complicated, but the politics get complicated. But but I think the way the rabbis understand it is by virtue of him following the commandments, he is in covenant, and now God and him have a personal relationship. Part of what's going to happen is as a larger narrative is we're going to go from Abraham and God having this personal relationship to that relationship expanding in steps. So it's going to go from Abraham to Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob and Esau, Jacob to his 12 children, his 12 children becoming into a nation. And so it's a kind of a generational step-by-step expanding the scope and the coverage of this covenant between God and Abraham and his descendants. So, he doesn't get circumcised. Abraham doesn't circumcise himself until a little later in a couple chapters, but as for all intent and purpose, he is in relationship with God at this moment. Other questions? Okay. So the Jewish community is not behaving properly. And they can drag the tzaddik down with them. We'll kind of go to the next one. Who wants to read this interpretation Avram descended? Margaret, you brought up Egypt, so if you want to read it, feel free. You're muted though. There you go.
Avram descended to Egypt. We interpret this as the tzaddik, who is called Avram, descends from his spiritual level. Even though he falls, he does not drop entirely, God forbid. Only he descends to Egypt, Mitzrayim, which is the acronym for Strait of the Sea. This alludes to the fact that his spiritual situation has been narrow, straight, and that he is pushed down from his upper holy position that he was at. Sea alludes to the higher holiness, the upper sea.
Good. This is a little weirdly phrased, but let's see if we can do it. So there's a famine in the land. There's a spiritual famine where the people, the community's not behaving according to God's will. And they drag the tzaddik down from maybe this high spiritual level to a lower level. Not all the way down to nothing. Chas v'shalom. That's every time you see God forbid, that's actually, it's God, chas v'shalom, God forbid. But you know, what's it called when we move to Israel? What do we call that?
Aliyah.
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 What does aliyah mean?
Go up.
Going up.
Good. You're going up because there's a kind of a spiritual ascension that you're doing in moving to Israel. What's it called when an Israeli moves out of Israel?
You're read to go to
Yerida. It's called yerida. It means dissension. You descend because you're going from a place of higher sanctity to a place of lower sanctity just by virtue of leaving Israel. So Avram is making yerida. He's going down. He's descending, not all the way to the bottom, but think of it kind of this way: we recently did this, but have you ever moved from a larger house to a small? Have you ever had to downsize?
Yes.
Yes.
Even in your space in your house.
Yes.
When you do that, things feel a lot more cramped, right?
Yes.
Like you feel like you used to have all this space in this big house, and now you're in this tiny place. And even though you might have gotten rid of a lot of stuff, it still feels like you're in this tight space that you weren't used to, right? People kind of understand and feel like have that sense. This is what Mitzrayim, and Mitzrayim will often be interpreted this way as Meitzar Yam. This is a common midrashic interpretation. It's like the narrow of the straits of the sea. Probably largely dealing with probably named Mitzrayim, probably was actually not so dissimilar because it's the Nile Delta goes up, right? And that's part of what makes Egypt is the Nile Delta, but it kind of narrows, like the Nile narrows itself as it goes up to there. So I actually think there's something to that midrash there. But saying when the tzaddik was on this high level, this high spiritual level, there was this great openness, the spiritual openness, the spiritual expansiveness that he would have experienced, and this connection to the world. But when you descend from that level, it's just like downsizing your home. You don't feel quite as expansive anymore. And so why does he go to Egypt? Why doesn't he go north? Or why doesn't he go east? He goes to Egypt because specifically that's how he feels spiritually. There's this kind of narrowness that you experience when you descend from your spiritual level. Does that make sense? Everybody kind of follow what he's saying there?
So his physical, again, the physical is the spiritual is representing itself in the physical, which is representing itself in the spiritual? Kind of, sort of?
Kind of. What I would say is it's more the text of the Torah is hinting at at something that's not going on physically, but spiritually.
Okay.
And that everything that's happening in the Torah is alluding to something at a deep spiritual level of what's happening. Yes, Mark.
Without going down a rabbit hole, just quickly, when Joseph goes down to Egypt, is that going to be seen in the same light?
To some extent, I think they interpret Joseph a little differently.
Okay, I'll wait till we get there.
In short, I'll give you the short version, is because we talked about it a little bit when we talked about Shabbatai Tzvi a couple of weeks ago. There's an idea in Lurianic Kabbalah. So Kabbalah itself has different interpretations. Two of the more prominent ones. One is Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and the other is Rabbi Isaac Luria. And the two of them were essentially contemporaries. They lived in Tzfat together around the same time. Their lives overlapped. But one of Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Ari, as he is often known as, one of his principles is that at the creation of the world, trying not to go too far down the rabbit hole, there's various structures that help control the divine energy flow into this world. And the initial attempt at creation, those vessels shattered, and their shards are scattered throughout the world. Now, part of our job is to lift up those shards and reunite them spiritually in the divine world. And we do that through mitzvot, through good deeds, and so on and so forth. But this was part of Shabbatai Tzvi as well, and his conversion to Islam. But in general, there's a concept which comes up in Hasidut, and somewhere down the line, I'm sure we'll investigate it in some depth, is that the tzaddik, the righteous, have to descend into the muck and the dirt and the grime and the lowest places in order to elevate those sparks and raise them back up. That's where I think that's more of what we see in describing Joseph, is that Joseph had to go down to Egypt to be able to elevate the sparks that were stuck there. Now, there's other ways that we'll interpret it. I'll be honest, I haven't prepped Joseph yet because we're not there yet. But that will probably come up at some point. But I think that's the way they generally look at Joseph, is there was a necessary dissension to be able to lift up the sparks that were trapped there. This is more of a spiritual descent on the tzaddik's part, and he's actually not going to go in the way of the sparks either. The Noam Elimelech, which it was interesting because I've read enough of his things, and I was reading this. I'm like, this feels weird for him to be saying, but I think there's an interesting part here, is that as part of, there's a relationship between the Rebbe and his congregation. And as in any relationship, you have a mutual effect on each other. So in the same way that you want the Rebbe, you want your rabbi to spiritually elevate you and bring you to a higher spiritual level and make you feel inspired and deep, there's also a way in which the congregation can bring down the Rebbe also by their behavior, and they can actually drag him down a little bit in spirituality also. And that's kind of what I hear him saying here, is that Avram represents the tzaddik, represents the Rebbe, but the behavior of those around him drew him down a level, drew him down spiritually because of their behavior, and he kind of felt cramped in this narrow space because of it. Now, is that necessary? Now, when we get to the next section, the question is this necessarily a bad thing? So if somebody wants to read the next section, we can discuss if this is actually, if it's bad for the Rebbe to have to descend a little bit. Somebody want to read?
I'll read. The blessing one does not do all of this just so the tzaddik will fall from his spiritual level because of the wicked's actions, but also for his own good to dwell there. For were not for this small fall from his level, it is possible that he may become arrogant and exaggerate his spiritual level and holiness. Now, when we see the tzaddik that fell from his spiritual level become very embarrassed and regret and think of himself as a stranger in the land, that is, he thinks of himself as a stranger in this world and in the world to come after he fell from his spiritual level.
You don't seem to like that, Marcia.
No, I don't. I don't.
Okay. Tell me, so what are you thinking?
That pink one is my latest one.
What don't you like about it, Marcia?
I just don't, maybe because I was reading it, maybe if I read it silently, it would make more sense.
Somebody else have a reaction while she's contemplating it.
I like it.
Because?
I like it because I like the idea of the humility of a leader. And while I don't wish anything bad on Avram, it's always good, I think, for a leader to step back and step down a level and not be too full of himself and lead through arrogance. And gives him by stepping back, by stepping down, Avram can see a bit more clearly to lead more effectively.
Good. Any other reactions?
I see it as no one can really live up to all of their expectations of themselves. And when they do fall short of what they do expect of themselves, I think it's only human. And yes, they may be embarrassed, but that's a point to build back up to a new level, perhaps.
Now, this says that the blessing one does not do all of this just so they'll fall from spiritual level. So this is saying that, or I'm reading it as saying that God allows this to happen.
Yes.
Okay.
God allows the community to misbehave a little bit. Now, I kind of like what Cindy was saying is that, you know, if you think about it, you know, if the leader, if the Rebbe is constantly being praised, if it's constantly being talked to, if they're constantly saying how wonderful they are, how wise they are, how fantastic they are, and everybody's so thrilled, then, you know, it's easy to say, wow, you know, maybe I'm really that good. And if the congregation's constantly elevating, there's a place where you say, you know, maybe I'm really that good of a rabbi to be able to elevate them and to lead them and to bring them up. And I can bring them up to the highest levels, and look how high of a level I'm at. And there's a way you can, as a leader, you could become a bit arrogant about it. But when you, excuse me, when, you know, the congregation's misbehaving, when they're not living up to their potential, when they're dragging you down a little bit, it's a reminder of how much work actually has to be done. And it reminds you as a leader that, okay, we're not there yet, and we still got work to do as a community to build ourselves up to keep moving forward. And yes, you know, when everybody wants to follow you and everybody wants to come to you and everybody wants your advice and everybody wants you to bless them and everybody wants looks to you, it's very easy to want to become arrogant about it. And Lord knows there's been enough rabbis who have fallen into that trap in their careers.
It seems
Probably
like
been enough rebbes who have fallen into that trap in their careers too. Yes, Suzanne.
the interesting thing to me is that it says he feels like a stranger. It's natural that he's embarrassed, but this is his community. So how does he separate himself, and how can he lead a group that he feels like a stranger from? I mean, how can it be a good thing for your leader to feel like a stranger? Cindy.
No, it's a good question. I think, you guys have been, how long have you guys been married?
How 62 years.
62 years. Do you still learn things about each other on occasion?
Rarely.
No,
Rarely, but on occasion. I'm sure there's times that you surprise each other with something that you're like, I didn't know that before. I know once in a while I'll tell a story and my wife's like, how have I never heard that story before? Like we've been dating for 20 years. We've been married for 16. Like, how have I not heard that story? And she'll do that on occasion too.
That's true. I did hear a story last month that I'd never heard before.
So there's a level at which when you think you're at this high place, you think you got everything sorted out. But when they misbehave and you end up lowering, you're like, maybe I need to learn about these people a little more. Maybe I need to get within this congregation a little more. Maybe I need to understand these people a little more. Maybe I'm a bit of a stranger in their midst, that I need to know who they are better so I can lead them better.
So it's a motivation. It's saying it serves as
I think so.
as a motivation for change rather than as a prediction of further exclusion.
Yes, I think there's a little bit of it is a humility that maybe you don't have it all sorted out. I haven't watched it in several years, but my wife and I used to be big NCIS fans. Love Gibbs. Gibbs is awesome, by the way. He was one of my favorite characters. It was, if somebody has to tell you that you should trust them, that's the first sign you don't trust them. Like anybody who says trust me without earning it should make you suspicious. That might have been a Tony quote actually, but I think it was Gibbs. So there's a little bit of, when you're on this high spiritual level, you're like, I got this, trust me. But when you get brought down a level, you're like, maybe I need to investigate, maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I don't know quite as much. And maybe we need to work together on this relationship to build ourselves back up. And frankly, I'm a stranger in the world. He feels like a stranger in the world to come also. Maybe he doesn't understand God and Judaism as well as he thinks either. Maybe he also has to learn more, study more, understand more, pray more, do more mitzvot, and able to rebuild his place both in this world and in the world to come in a way that he isn't when he's dropped down a level. He has to kind of work his way back up again. Other comments, questions, thoughts?
Well, just the idea of the stranger, when we're talking about not taking everything else literally, when I think of myself as being a stranger somewhere, it's a level of discomfort. sort of when we fast on Yom Kippur, it's we afflict ourselves so that we can, we can atone better. And so this discomfort that he has from being a stranger is actually part of that humbling experience and a motivator, rather than just the idea, well, this is a strange place and I don't belong here.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a little bit of that is tied back into Avram too, is that, Avram was a stranger walking into Egypt. This wasn't his country. This wasn't his rule. He was a stranger in a strange land. And that's the way we feel when we're in this lower spiritual level. And it should push us to want to get back to a higher level, both in this world and the world to come, spiritually and physically. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Marcia, how are you feeling about it now, by the way?
I've enjoyed hearing everybody's comments, but it's okay. I'm listening to all of it.
What are your thoughts?
I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't. I'll have to dwell on this a little bit more, but I've enjoyed everybody's comments. Do you stay a tzaddik even if you have fallen from grace?
So I wanted to make a distinction there. It doesn't say that tzaddik necessarily did anything wrong. The tzaddik's not the one transgressing. It's a little bit similar to one of the ideas we talked about last week around Noah, right? Like if Noah had been in one of the concepts of Noah is if he had been in a different generation, he would have been even more righteous than he was. But the fact that he was in such a wicked generation dragged him down a little. This isn't necessarily a critique that the tzaddik is doing something necessarily wrong. It's the tzaddik is surrounded by people who are doing things wrong, and that can drag you down spiritually.
It's kind of like even us. If you're around people that are happy, let's just say happy and in a good boisterous mood, you kind of tend to be in that mood too. Whereas when you're around people that are ho-hum and in the dumps, you kind of, misery loves company, so you kind of get in that mood too, kind of thing, I guess. Not that he was doing anything wrong, but spiritually, because of all and the only other word I can think of is uncleanliness or spiritual energy that was around him was polluting his spiritual energy, so therefore he couldn't elevate him. It couldn't elevate to the extent that it could have if he'd been around more righteous people.
Yeah, I like, we tell our kids, right? Like, choose your friends wisely. Like, surround yourself with good people, because if you're surrounded by good people, they'll help make sure you're a good person. If you surround yourself with bad people, they're going to drag you down with them. Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit of a problem in that he's feeling so responsible for the entire community. It says that he became very embarrassed, and he didn't do anything, and yet he was embarrassed. So that can really weigh on you if you let actions of other people affect you in such a powerful way.
Yes, and I try not to get political here, but this is what we do with our presidents, right? Inflation goes up. Who gets the responsibility? right?
Yeah, but
Other bad things
I hear
happen
you.
in the country, and we look to the president to be like, well, why aren't you doing something about it? President's not entirely responsible for all the problems, yet they're the ones that are under the biggest microscope. And as a leader, that's a little bit of how it goes. Is you're right, you might not be directly responsible for their misbehavior. People have free will, they make their own choices, but you're still the leader, and you bear some responsibility for what happens. That's part of what happens when you're the leader. So
That's part, yeah. That's why.
So he's not necessarily embarrassed because of what he did, but he can be embarrassed for the people that he leads and be like, this is not what I was trying to teach you to do. This is not who I wanted you to be, and this is not who I've taught you to be. When your children do something wrong, you might be embarrassed for them, but you might feel bad about it, might be embarrassed, but you realize you didn't do it. You're not responsible for their actions and their choices. You still feel you still feel bad about it though.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like a football coach where Nick Saban was very embarrassed when Alabama got 15 penalties. Even though he wasn't playing, he still felt the heat. So I hear you. I guess I didn't, in my mind, that Hasidic didn't like run for that office. He just became that, and therefore it was a little oppressive for him to feel all that responsibility.
Yeah, I hear you. He wasn't there wasn't a congregational vote to bring him in,
right,
but the people still made the choice to follow him.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not they filled out a ballot or raised their hands, they still are voting with their behavior that they're following this person as their leader. So in that sense, it might not have been democratic, but they still voted for him and still choosing him as their leader.
Yeah.
So to what extent is a tzaddik an absolute versus a relative position?
So that's a somewhat complicated, loaded question. I think the way I'll answer it is, I'm not sure anybody's a complete tzaddik, right? I think we're all, I always think of the metaphor we use on the high holidays of the book of life and the book of death, which I don't really believe in, but we all kind of know the metaphor. The completely righteous are written in the book of life, the completely wicked are written in the book of death right away. Everybody else is ben yonim, in between. I'm pretty sure the vast majority of people are ben yonim in the first place. We are, as one of my phrases that you will hear me say a lot is, we are imperfect people living in an imperfect world. So we're going to make mistakes, we're going to make errors, we're going to make bad choices. It's kind of inevitable that we're not going to be perfect. And that's okay. And that's why God created the concept of tshuva in the first place. That's why the rabbis in the Midrash say that the world can't exist without tshuva. Because if we were punished for every bad deed we did, the world would have fallen apart would have been destroyed a long time ago. So do I believe in complete tzaddik? Not really. I think, Hasidic thought, the rebbes will argue that with me, and that's fine. But I think largely it's based on individual behavior. And you could be a completely righteous person and leading a group of unrighteous people and be dragged down, which is kind of where I think the Noam Elimelech is going with this. But you're still completely righteous because it's your behavior. I think where you fall a little bit is when you yourself are making bad choices.
I really meant to ask a slightly different question. And let me see if I can phrase it again, and maybe it's not worth asking, but I was really wondering whether, so to speak, the most righteous person in the community is the tzaddik, or whether there are, criteria that are
that make you a tzaddik?
Unquestionable criteria.
So again,
to
I
be
think
a tzaddik.
in Hasidic thought, a lot of it has to do with education, training, and frankly, I think there's a level of charisma that's involved in it also. That being said, the reason I teach it Hasidut and the reason I like Hasidut is because I want to democratize it a little bit. Is that in some sense, okay, are any of us actual tzaddikim? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not, I will say I'm not. You guys can judge for yourselves. I'm not gonna judge you. But there's a point at which we can also think of this as me being the tzaddik, me wanting to be a more righteous person. How can this apply to me? And to some extent, I think there's two levels of this. One is kind of what I said, there's a relationship between the Rebbe and his community. And I think there's a level that we don't always think of, in which, as much as we look to the Rebbe, the rabbi, our leaders to lift us up, there's a place in which the community can drag down the leaders also. And I think that's an important distinction that we don't often think about as a community. But on a personal level, I think there's a question of who do we surround ourselves with? And regardless of who that is, even our closest friends, even our closest family will, intentionally or not, sometimes drag us down a spiritual level. And what that does is help remind us of the work that's still left to do in the relationship. And how can we build each other back up to elevate each other up to that next spiritual level that we might have fallen from based on whatever is happening. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't teach us to make you think about, this is what they thought about the tzaddik. I want you to actually think of how this is applied to you. And inevitably, when we get dragged down, how can that feed us to help motivate us to rebuild up in relationship with each other?
The one thing that all these people in the Torah that are called tzaddiks, none of them are absolutely, to me, none of them are absolutely righteous, because they all do stupid stuff. I mean, Abraham slept with his maid, had a kid, an outside baby, as they say down south. Moses hit the rock twice when God told him not to, and Abraham lies about his wife being his sister. I mean, not once but twice. So it gives me hope.
I have a sermon on this that I won't give you the whole sermon that I've written on this. what I will say in a kind of some summary fashion is, yes, our heroes are not perfect in the Bible. And in part, I think that's why the Torah and the Bible have sustained faith for so long.
Mhm.
Because it's not some unattainable goal of achievement that we can't hope to ever become. But rather it's flawed humans trying to do the best they can in faith and relationship with God.
Mhm.
And that we can relate to intimately, because we too are flawed. We might not be sleeping with our handmaidens. We may not be passing our wives off as our sisters. We may not be trying to sacrifice our children. We may not be to use a different hero, we may not be throwing somebody's husband into battle so he
into
can
battle.
die, so that I can marry his wife. I mean, whom I was already having an affair with. Yeah, like we may not be doing these individual things, but we see deep, we can recognize and acknowledge the deep flaws, and we can relate to the flawed nature of our heroes. And I think that makes it much more relatable than somebody who is perfect in every way and something that we can never hope to achieve.
Right.
Somewhere down the line, like somewhere in my heart, I think of like Marvel movies and the superhero movies. I think part of what makes them so, they're well done, but I think part of what makes them so attractive is all of them have deep flaws also.
Mm.
Whether it's Tony Stark's arrogance or Thor's arrogance or Banner's anger management issues, they all have issues that we can relate to. Heck, even Steve Rogers' naivete. There's balance in that, and that we can relate to flawedness. It's much harder to relate to perfection because it doesn't exist.
Would a good title for this be When Bad Things Happen to Good People? Or just the opposite? When good things happen to bad people?
So I'd say bad things happening to good people is a different teaching. Somewhere down the line, maybe we'll take a look at Rebbe Nachman, who is a fascinating character in and of himself, but has a fascinating yet problematic view of when bad things happen to good people. So we'll somewhere down the line, when I don't feel like teaching a particular parsha, we'll come back to it. We'll probably do that with the Baal HaTanya too. We'll look at the Tanya at some point too, who neither Rebbe Nachman nor the Tanya actually. Most Hasidic rebbes will go parsha by parsha and give their commentaries. The Tanya and Rebbe Nachman intentionally don't. Theirs are much more treatises into what life should look like. But another time, another week, we'll deal with it. Any last questions, comments, thoughts, ponderings, ruminations, reflections?
No, just the same thing as last week. Now, when I go back and read it, I'm gonna look at it in this whole like spiritual, metaphorical sense instead of just like literally, because that's kind of how I tend to read it literally.
Yeah,
so.
and look, the rabbis say that there's an expression called pardes. Have you guys heard about pardes before? It's actually an acronym on how the different levels of midrashic thought. So P is a pshat, which is like the literal meaning of the text. Reish, the R is rebbes. It's like a hint. It's alluding to something deeper, but you don't actually quite get that deep. Mem is D is drash. It's midrash, which tries to explain what was alluded to. And the S is sod, or the secret, which is like the deep spiritual meaning underneath. And rabbis, for even in the Talmud, they kind of get this kind of Peshat Midrash kind of deal going on. But there's this idea that every text, every verse has all 4 levels within it. You just need to dig down to be able to get to all 4. So this is really dealing with the sod, with the secret spiritual meaning that's really buried in the text itself. So good. Hope you do keep doing that and try to figure out what is the spiritual meaning you can learn from each text.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was very interesting.
Well, thank y'all for coming. Thank you for being here. Wishing everybody a fantastic week ahead. As always, stay well, stay healthy, and stay safe. We'll do this again next week. So come back next week. We'll deal with Vayera, and
We have to
if I
say,
don't see you before then, I'll see you then.
one thing we have to say is roll tide.
No, we don't.
No, we don't.
Go to Egypt.
All right, be well, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good week. And if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.